The MACCUTCHEON variation of the French defence, written by Shaun Taulbut, read by Michael Basman. Side 1. The MACCUTCHEON variation is a dynamic counter-attacking line in the French defence. It's never achieved the popularity of the Vinave variation, which it resembles, but all the same it does give black many counter chances. Possibly the reason that white chances are usually favoured in this line is that black tends to lose his king's knight, get it exchanged off, and that makes the defence of his king's side a little more difficult than in the Vinave variation. Also, black's pawn counter-attack, pawn to c5, is usually delayed a move or so, and this also harms his chances. But as we'll see, there are many fascinating lines in this variation, and it's quite a good bet for the second player. Now we're going to play e4, e6, d4, d5, white knight to c3. This is the aggressive line. Black plays knight f6, and now white goes bishop to g5, no doubt hoping to go into the classical variation, which usually gives white some edge because he manages to exchange off his bishop against black's bishop on f8, and then white is left with the better bishop. Now, instead of playing bishop e7, black plays a surprising move, bishop to b4, and this move was first played in a simultaneous by the inventor, Mr. MACCUTCHEON, against the world champion Stylish, and he actually managed to win this game, thus launching the variation in fine style. Well, that game was played about 100 years ago. Now, usually in this position, white plays his pawn up to e5, putting pressure on the knight on f6. But first, we're going to look at the line where white exchanges on d5. He plays e takes d5. Black could recapture with the pawn, which looks fairly safe, though later he may have to bring his bishop back to e7 to break the pin on his knight on f6. However, we won't look at that line. We're going to look at where black plays queen takes d5, taking advantage of the fact that the white knight on c3 is pinned, and also the queen hits the bishop at g5. So, rather than lose time retreating it, and also being aware that he's threatened by the move knight to e4, white plays bishop takes f6. Black g takes f6. This looks like a small benefit for black because he's gained the two bishops. Now we're going to look at the game Giorgio against Seuss and see how the game actually, how things actually panned out. Now, white played knight from g1 to e2. This is an important move, defending his knight on c3, and therefore he's avoiding double pawns. And now black decided on a plan to preserve his own bishop. So he played queen to a5. White played pawn to a3. And now black was able to retreat his bishop back to e7, keeping the two bishops. I want you to turn off your tapes and decide what you'd play as white here. Well, white's move was the very strong pawn to g3, and even though he's only got one bishop, he's going to put it on a very good diagonal, and at the same time black's going to have trouble developing his own bishop. So g3, and black played pawn to c6, which blocked the line of white's bishop, but certainly doesn't help the play with his other bishop. So pawn to c6, white bishop to g2, black knight to d7, white castles kingside. Well, this position resembles the g takes f6 line of the Caro-Kann, and normally one would suggest for black to drop his queen back to c7 so that it doesn't get exposed, and then play pawn to b6 and bishop to b7. And if black could do this, then he'd have a very good game. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem to work, because if he goes queen to c7 and later pawn to b6, white may have the annoying move knight to b5. And then if black takes the knight, white will play bishop takes rook. So it looks like it's going to be difficult for black to play this move, pawn to b6. And if he can't play this, then it's rather hard for him to get his bishop out. His whole development is messed up. He may have to do something like knight f8 and bishop d7, which still doesn't look very, very promising for him. Now, seeing as he didn't have anything useful to do in the development sense, black now launched into a kingside attack by playing pawn to h5. White played pawn to b4. Black's queen went to f5. And white just came on with pawn to b5, starting his own attack. Now, if black takes the pawn by pawn takes b5, white can probably go pawn to d5, slashing through in the center, and he can pick up the b5 pawn later. Well, instead of capturing on b5, black played pawn to c5, and white played pawn to d5. When white gets pawn to d5 in these sorts of positions, he's usually got a very good game. Black continued his attack, two-piece attack, pawn to h4, and white played pawn takes e6, black pawn takes e6. White knight came to f4. Well, white's opening's been very successful here. He's getting ready to attack down the central files. Black's king hasn't got a haven yet, and his queenside is in an awful state of undevelopment. Now let's see how white manages to convert this into a victory. Black played f takes g3 here. White played f takes g3. Sorry, black played h takes g3. White played f takes g3. And black played queen to h7, threatening the h2 pawn. Perhaps you'd like to switch off here and decide how would you play as white. Well, instead of playing h2, h3, which is quite good, white played his knight straight away to e4. He's planning on some piece of tactics. If black plays queen takes h2 check after king to f2, black's not just threatened with knight takes e6 and knight to d6 check, he's also threatened by rook to h1, which would trap his queen. So black didn't do this. He played his knight from d7 to e5. And this move now threatens queen takes h2 check, because later on black's liable to be able to play knight to g4 check. So white now did play pawn to h3. This move holds the threat of knight d6 check, so black defends this with knight to f7. White went queen to e2, and black at last developed his bishop to d7. Now perhaps you'd like to turn off your tapes here, decide how you'd play as white. Well, piece of tactical wizardry, white went knight from f4 to d5. If the knight's taken, white will just play knight takes f6 check, and the knight can't be taken because of the pin along the king file, the e file. So black tried to defend f6, but everything's falling around him. He played queen to g7. White knight from e4 took on f6 check. Black bishop takes f6. White knight takes f6 check. Black king to e7. Now we've got a few more moves where white's just increasing his advantage because the black king is hopelessly exposed, and also black is a pawn down. White played queen f2, threatening the c5 pawn. Black went knight to d6. White played queen takes c5. Black rook to c8. White queen e5. There's a threat of course, knight d5 check, and the black queen would go. So black just went back to f7, knight to f7, hitting the queen. Now white played knight d5 check, black king to f8. Okay, now it's your move again. What would you play as white? Well, I hope you saw the move rook takes f7 check, which is the most elegant way to finish black off. If black takes the rook with the queen, then queen takes h8 check, finishes him off. And I think black resigned here, because if king takes rook, we get rook f1 check. Black king has to go to g8, and now knight to f6 check. And there's going to be some discover check soon, which will win the black queen. Now, white shouldn't usually get such a crushing position from this line. E takes d5, but the very shortness of the game shows that one should be careful of it. It's very interesting the way white fin-shepherded his bishop, and the power of that bishop compared to black's on c8 was quite amazing. Now, what black should have done was very early on, after queen takes d5 and white played bishop takes f6, black shouldn't have recaptured straight away. He should have played bishop takes c3 check, pawn takes c3, and then black recaptures on f6. Now the reason for this is to shatter white's pawns so that they're not quite so mobile, and they can't harm the black queen so much. The black queen is liable to have more places to go to if there are doubled and isolated pawns. When the pawns are intact, then her squares are limited and she may get exposed. So that would probably have given black much better chances of obtaining equality than the way Seuss plays. Now I'd like you to return your pieces to the start position, play out the first four moves again. That's e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, knight f6, white bishop to g5, black bishop to b4. Now the most regular move is for white to play pawn to e5, which at first sight appears to win a piece, but this isn't so because the bishop on g5 can be driven away with gain of time. Black plays pawn to h6 here. Now in this position, it doesn't do white much good to retreat bishop back to h4, because black would then play pawn to g5, and as the bishop went to g3, black's knight would then come in to e4, putting pressure on the knight at c3. So usually, after pawn to h6, the white bishop drops back to e3 or d2. Well, we'll look at those two moves in due course, but first we want to look at white's attempt to smash up black's king's position by playing e takes on f6. This is a line which Tigran used to like quite a lot. Black replies pawn takes g5, white plays pawn takes g7, and black plays rook to g8. This is quite an attractive looking line for white because he seems to have a pawn almost ready to queen on g7, and also black's king side is messed up totally, and black's a long way from getting his king into safety. However, black isn't usually frightened in this sort of position. Partly, I suppose, because he retains for the moment his black squared bishop, and that defends him on the black squares, and his pawn chain from f7 to d5 defends him from diagonal attacks or even attacks down the central file. So white's only way of getting through is going to be along the H file. Now we're going to look at a game between Basman and Hayes, played in 1973 at Ilford, and we'll see that white succeeded in this game, but though black's opening, again, it was the opening very early on, where black could have improved and perhaps got a better game. So after black rook to g8, white here played knight to f3, and black brought his queen to f6. He's not in a hurry to move his rook off the back rank. White now played pawn to h4, planning to open up the h file. Of course, if black plays pawn to g4, then white will have a fast king's rook pawn. So black captures, pawn takes on h4, and white played rook takes h4. Now at this point, the source of black's troubles began, because he played queen takes g7 here, which looks quite natural, but instead knight to c6 would have been better. The point of playing knight to c6 and delaying the capture of the pawn at g7 is to keep an eye on the rook at h4. The queen attacks the rook at h4. Now if black plays knight c6, and then if white goes bishop b5, black can go bishop d7 and then castle queenside. And the value of black keeping his queen for the while on f6 is that white isn't able to play knight to e5 because it leaves his rook on free. So black, missing this, began to get into difficulties. He played queen takes g7, and now white's pieces are freed. His knight is free to come in at e5 at some time or other. Now after queen takes g7, white plays his queen up to d3, and black played bishop to d7. And now white played rook to h7, gaining a tempo on the queen. Now here it looks as though black can play queen to g6 to offer an exchange of queens, likely to consider whether this is a good move or not. Well, queen to g6 isn't so good, not because of queen takes queen, because after rook takes queen, rook h8 check, black has got bishop back to f8. Now, after queen to g6, white has got his move knight to e5. This knight is freed and now comes in at the right moment. Black now plays queen takes queen, and white plays bishop takes queen. Now the f7 pawn is on freeze, so black plays rook to f8, and now white simply can play knight takes f7, because after rook takes f7, bishop to g6 is very strong. Now let's return our pieces to diagram 1, and we'll see there that black didn't play queen to g6. He played his queen up to f6. Now white didn't immediately bring his knight into e5. He played the move pawn to a3. This is to get rid of the black bishop. Now this bishop hasn't got that many good squares to go to. If it goes back to f8 or e7, then there are possibilities of knight to b5. And if it goes back to d6, then there are other difficulties that black faces, because white has the move queen to e3. White's having to play on tempo, because if black gets time to play knight c6 and castle, he may be okay. So white's queen e3 move threatens knight takes d5, and of course black doesn't want to really play pawn to c6, because that will incarcerate his pieces. So black plays queen back to e7. Now white plays bishop to d3. Doesn't seem to be much point to that move. Black plays knight to c6. I wonder what you'd play as white in this position. Well, white has surprising move here of bishop to g6, just stopping black in the nick of time. Black plays rook takes bishop, then rook to h8 check will win his queen, and of course pawn takes bishop's out of the question. So black has to defend f8. He plays rook to f8. White comes in knight to g5, and now black has to play knight to d8. And of course white's achieved his objective of preventing black from castling, and white will probably just play bishop back to h5 now, and gradually build up his attacking position. Now let's turn once again to diagram 1, and we'll look and see what black actually did play. Now from diagram 1, you must add the moves black queen f6, white pawn to a3. Black didn't exchange the bishop for the knight, because after queen takes c3, knight c6, white will be able to play pawn to b4 fairly soon, and put pressure upon black's game. So instead black retreated his bishop to a5. He reckons that it may be driven away and even be put out on a limb, say at b6. But any advance that white makes on the queen side has to be weighed up against the fact that white wants to castle on the queen side. So white's a bit insecure about whether he should advance pawn to b4. After all, he wants a safe spot for his king. There we are. Now after bishop to a5, white still continued pawn to b4, black bishop b6. Now the move white queen to e3, putting the queen on the black diagonals, because he's got a bishop which works on the white diagonals, and he wants to get that out quite soon. Also, queen to e3 threatens knight takes d5. Now black here played queen to e7. And I'd like you to turn off the tapes and decide what you'd play for white here. Now at first sight, a very attractive move here is knight to e5. It looks crushing, because if black plays rook f8, white will come in with knight to g6. But in fact, knight to e5 isn't so crushing. White's position suddenly finds itself overextended, because black plays knight to c6. If white now plays rook takes f7, black swings out with queen to g5. And here he's getting a counterattack going himself. Trouble for white in this position is that his d4 pawn is very weak. So if he plays queen takes queen, black plays rook takes queen, and then white's threatened with moves like knight takes knight, or even bishop takes d4. And there are so many of his pieces strung along this long diagonal that he's going to lose quite a few of them. So this was why white rejected the move knight to e5. Let's replace some of the pieces. Put the black queen back on e7, white rook back on h7, black pawn on f7, white knight back on f3, and the black knight back on b8. White has a queen on e3. So instead of knight to e5, white decided to keep black bottled up by playing the move pawn to b5 here. White reasons that it may take black a couple of moves to get rid of that pawn and then play knight c6. And meanwhile, white's got the threat of knight to e5, which should finish black off if white has time to play it. So pawn to b5. Against that, black played pawn to c5, and this once again holds up white's knight e5 because of the answer pawn takes d4. So faced with this fork, white played knight to a4, getting his knight out of the way. Black played pawn takes d4. Now it wouldn't be thematic for white to now play knight takes d4, because he wants his knight to go to the e5 square. So instead white plays queen to f4, still retaining his plan of bringing his knight into e5. Very, very consistent, of course. Well, he has to make some concessions in this, because after queen to f4, black plays bishop to a5 check, and the white king has to go to d1. So it looks like white's king isn't any safer than black's. Certainly no chance of castling queenside for that piece. Now, black played pawn to a6 here, and of course white has to act fast in this position. He's faced with pawn takes g5 and knight to c6, and then black's centre is really going to start to roll along. So I'd like you to turn off your tapes and decide what you play for white here. Well, the first move is knight to e5, and this threatens the f7 square. Of course, again, if black plays rook f8, we've got knight to g6 coming in, should win the exchange. However, black has got a counter-attack here, or a counter-defense. After knight to e5, he plays bishop to c7. Now, if you didn't study this move too carefully, I suggest you look at it now and decide what you'd do as white in this position after black's bishop to c7. Well, the path is still very treacherous here, because again it looks like white can play something like rook takes f7 in this position. In fact, this move doesn't quite work out again because of black's move queen to g5. Well, I said black plays queen g5, but actually I don't think he does, because after queen g5, white's got rook f8 check. King e7, queen f7 check looks very strong. So it looks like queen to g5 isn't the right move, but queen to d6 can still be played by black. Now we get some moves here. White plays rook takes d7. Black has to play queen takes b7. White plays knight takes d7. Black plays bishop takes f4. Well, we better stop here and count up the pieces. White's exchanged down at the moment, and he's got a knight en prise. So it looks like he should recover his material by playing knight to f6 check. Black can play king f7. White plays knight takes rook. Now here, if black was to recapture meekly king takes knight, then white knight to b6 looks okay for white. But instead, black doesn't play that. He plays pawn takes on b5. White plays bishop takes b5. And now black plays knight to c6. Now we'll see the reason for this in a couple of seconds. The knight on g8, white's knight on g8 is trapped. It's just a question of what black captures it with. Now looking at the position, white sees that if he can get the bishop away from f4, he might be able to move his knight off. So white plays pawn to g3. However, this move has got a flaw in it. I wonder if you could spot it. Yes, the bishop doesn't have to move away, which will allow knight to h6 check. In fact, black can now play rook takes g8. And now if pawn takes bishop, black will play rook to g1 check and pick up the rook on a1. So the net result of this sequence seems to be a position of equal material, though in fact black has the better game, I should think, because he's got a central phalanx of pawns. Well, this was the reason why white didn't go into the line, because of this long variation, which doesn't lead to his advantage and possibly leads to his disadvantage, and of course white's hoping for the win. So let's return all our pieces to the right position, and perhaps we can find a better move for white. This is the diagram 2, and its position after black's bishop c7. Well, have you got the position of diagram 2? You might be surprised how white managed to work out all this long line, but the reason is probably that people now and then play good games of chess, and this happened to be one of white's better games. Now, so from diagram 2, if rook takes f7 check, rook takes f7 doesn't work, what does work for white? You can have another chance, turn off the tapes and decide what you'd play for white here. The winning move for white is in fact knight to b6. The idea is to deflect the bishop away from the pin on the knight, and then white can clean up with rook takes f7. Of course, the knight can't be left there because it's much too powerful on b6. Black plays rook to a7, then rook takes f7 will probably win. So black plays bishop takes b6. White now plays rook takes f7. Black plays queen to d6. And white plays, well, what would you play for white here? White plays rook takes d7. Knight takes d7. Queen f7 check. All this is pretty well forced, and white begins to win a bit of material. King to d8. Queen takes rook check. Well, it's not that good if black plays queen to f8 because of queen takes e6, and then there's the threat on the knight on d7 and the bishop at b6. Also, knight to f8, of course, is no good. It loses the queen to a knight fork. So black decided to jettison the other rook by playing king c7. White played queen takes a8. Black played queen takes e5. Now, exchange ahead, but still black's got quite a lot of counterplay, and white's pieces are scattered. His own king is rather insecure. So white has to play a bit carefully here. He played pawn takes on a6. Black played pawn takes on a6. White now played queen takes a6, and black threw in the move pawn to d3. This threatens to open up the white king even more, and also of course threatens queen takes rook check. So white had to guard the rook. He played rook to b1. Black here played bishop takes f2. He got a threat of mate here by, of course, queen to e1. White defended against this threat by playing rook to b7 check, king d8, and now queen to a5 check, king to e8, white bishop takes d3. Now black tried a few more desperate checks, but they didn't work. Let's see how the game continued. Black played queen to h5 check. White king c1. Black queen to h1 check. White king to b2. Black bishop to d4 check. White moves pawn to c3. Black queen takes g2 check. White bishop moves back to c2. Black plays bishop to e5. His attack is now gone, and white moves in for the kill. Queen to b5, threatening the knight at d7. Black queen to g7. White bishop moves to a4. And here black resigned because more pieces are going to go, and it's a hopeless position. Well, this sort of game shows what white can do in this line once he gets going. But if you happen to play this black, then remember our tips. That is, don't capture the pawn on g7 too soon. Try and get your queenside pieces out a bit quicker. And certainly remember it was useful in this game for black to keep his queen on f6, attacking the rook at h4, thus preventing white from playing knight to e5. Now we're going to go on to diagram 3, and this is the position after black's just played pawn to h6. And we won't capture on f6, so white will retreat the bishop. Usually is bishop back to d2. We're going to look at bishop back to e3, which is also pretty good and somewhat neglected, in fact, stronger than its reputation. Now after bishop to e3, black usually goes knight to e4, putting pressure on the knight at c3. So it's certainly a moot point whether black should not keep his knight back on the king's side, say move it to back to g8 or d7. We'll see how this knight causes black certain embarrassment later on. After knight to e4, white doesn't bother to defend the knight at c3. He starts his own attack on the king's side by queen to g4. And black's g7 pawn is in great danger here. So if black played knight takes c3, white would play queen takes g7, and he'd be hitting the rook at f8. If black now played knight e4 check, there's simply c3, and white would certainly regain his piece and have shattered black's kingside as well. So after queen to g4, black has to defend the g pawn. Rook g8 isn't going to be much good after an eventual bishop takes h6, so the choice is between king to f8 or pawn to g6. Now, if pawn to g6, we'll look at the sort of line that white may play. Now, white is going to play pawn to a3, black bishop takes c3 check, white pawn takes c3, black knight takes c3, and now white plays bishop to d3. This was a game played in USSR in 1977, and though white's a pawn down, actually he has got an advantage. His bishops are doing a lot of good work aiming at black's kingside. Now, black plays queen to e7 here, and white plays pawn to h4. Now, black often wins a pawn in this variation, but his knight on c3 is often misplaced, and it's hard to get it back into the game. In fact, in order to get some counterplay, black often has to return the pawn. White's plan will probably be to move his rook up to h3 and then into g3 and get some attack going that way. Now we're going to leave the move pawn to g6. I want you to go back to diagram 4, and we're going to look at the move king to f8 instead. We've actually got an interesting game to show you in that variation. Now, this was a game between Klovan and Chernyshevsky, Soviet Union. Black played king f8, and as in the last example, white played pawn to a3, black played bishop takes c3, white pawn takes c3, and black played knight takes pawn on c3. White now plays bishop to d3, and once again we get this slightly trapped knight on c3, and in order to free his game, black now plays pawn to c5. He's hoping that white will capture, which white has to do. Pawn takes on c5, then black plays knight to c6, hitting the e pawn. White plays knight to f3, defending the pawn on e5. Now white's got more control of d4 than black, so black can't play actually pawn to d4. And if black plays something like queen to a5, then he's really deserting the king side. White will probably just castle in that case and retain the pressure which he has in the position. So instead of playing that, queen to a5, black tried the move pawn to f5. Now if white ignores this, then black's game improves enormously because he'll be able to bring his knight into e4 and white will just be blotted out. So white has to capture pawn takes on f6. En passant, black recaptures queen takes pawn on f6. Now, you better turn off the tapes and decide what you'd play as white in this position. How would you continue? What do you think his plans should be? Now in this position, black has got the threat of pawn to e5, and if he gets it in, well, he's going to move on to e4 and fork two pieces. Of course, pawn to e5 also gains a tempo on the white queen. So it looks like black's pawns are going to start to get mobile against the white position. So white played in answer queen to h5. Now let's see, is he stopping pawn to e5? Well, black didn't think he was. He played pawn to e5 anyway. Now, in this position, white's got the chance of winning the exchange in a couple of ways. He can try to play, say, bishop to g5. Then if black plays pawn takes bishop, white can play queen takes rook check. However, after black plays king to e7, black's pawns are very well placed. He's threatening pawn to e4, and he's probably got very good compensation for the exchange. Same applies if white plays knight to h4 and then moves into g6 check. He can win the exchange, but he doesn't really solve the problem of the mobility of the black pawns. Therefore, instead of these moves, white moved his bishop from d3 to g6. This prevents the pawn fork, and meanwhile white has actually got a threat. And it's not just to win the exchange. The idea is to play bishop to g5. Then if black takes the bishop, white can play queen takes h8 check, king to e7, and then queen to e8 is going to be mate. So that's the point of white's move. Now in order to defend against this threat of bishop to g5, black played bishop to d7. Now, does this really defend against the threat? I'd like you to turn off and decide. This is in fact the position of diagram 5. Well, bishop to g5 is playable by white, but let's see what its consequence is. After bishop to g5, black will play pawn takes bishop. Doesn't seem to have any other moves with his queen. White plays queen takes rook check. Black king to e7, and white takes off the other rook. And now black plays queen takes g6. Now we've got a situation where black is 2 exchanges down, but both the white rooks are virtually unmoved. In fact, they are literally unmoved, and black therefore has got time to build up an attack against the white position. So, in order to defend against the threat of queen to e4 check, white castles kingside. After white castles, it's suggested that black should go pawn to g4. White knight moves to d2, and now black takes the pawn on c2. And the knight on d2 isn't very well placed, hasn't got really anywhere to go. So black's still got a very mobile position. He seems to have full compensation for his sacrificed material. Now let's return to the position of diagram 5, and we'll see in that position, in fact, white didn't play bishop to g5 at all. Well, from diagram 5, white in fact just castled kingside. Black now played king to g8, which at least stops the threat of bishop to g5. And white played his rook from f1 to e1. Black played rook from a8 to e8. White moved back his bishop to d2, threatening to capture the knight at c3, and black played knight to e4. I'd like you to turn off and decide what you'd play for white here. Well, if you played bishop takes e4, pawn takes e4, rook takes e4, you wouldn't be doing too well after bishop to f5, and then black would play pawn to e4, and he's getting quite mobile with his pawns and his counterattack. Well, white didn't capture the pawn. He simply centralized his pieces. He realized he's virtually a rook up in the center thanks to black's trapped rook on h8, so he plays his rook from a1 to d1. Black now played bishop f5, white played bishop takes f5, black queen takes f5, white queen takes f5, black rook takes f5. And we will discuss the endgame on the second side. MACCUTCHEON variation, side 2. Now we left the game in an endgame where black has been doing quite well. He's managed to get his pawns moving in the center. They look quite strong. Unfortunately, as his rook on h8 is still out of play, white is able to mount a quick attack against the weakened black pawns at d5 and b7, and black has to tread very carefully to maintain equality in this circumstance. Now let's see if he manages to do it. After black's rook takes f5, white shot out with pawn to c4. Of course, black can't take the pawn because the rook takes on e4, so black plays knight takes on d2. Now if white takes with the rook, black will take on c4, won't have any problems. So white recaptures with the knight, knight takes on d2, and black pushes on pawn to d4. White rook now moved to b1, shifting the attack to the backward pawn, or restrained pawn should we say, on b7. So black of course retreated his rook to f7 to guard it. White played his knight out to e4, putting a blockade on the pawn at e5. Okay, turn off your tapes here and decide how you'd play for black. As I said, despite having what is in appearance the better pawn structure, because white's got isolated and double pawns on the queen's side, in fact black does have to tread very carefully here, and he's threatened with the move knight to d6 to win his b pawn. Black should have played his rook to d7, relying on a piece of tactics to save his b pawn, because if white played now knight to d6, black would be able to play pawn to b6, and then white can't play pawn takes b6 because the rook takes d6, and of course black wins a piece. So rook to d7 was the move, and it probably holds the position, keeps the game equal for black. Instead we got a blunder from black. He played king to h7, very anxious to reactivate his rook, but he should have delayed it at least one move. White now brought his knight into d6. Black played rook to c7. Possibly rook d7 was better here as well. But anyway, white now played knight takes b7. He doesn't want to take with the rook because after the exchange of rooks, black would be able to play rook to b8. So he takes with the knight. Black played rook b8. White knight went back to d6. Rook took rook. White played rook takes rook. Now black decided he wanted to get some counterattack against the white c pawns. Possibly I feel he should have done it by playing pawn to d3 here, jettisoning possibly his d pawn, but hoping to pick up a couple of white's pawns. So if he plays d3, and white plays rook d1, black knight to d4. Now if white rook takes d3, black can play rook takes c5, followed by rook back to c6, and the white c-pawn may be in danger. So instead of white playing rook takes d3, he'd probably play knight to e4. Then after black plays knight e6, rook takes d3, knight takes c5. Black has some drawing chances. Well, d3 wasn't played. Black instead, let's reset some of these pieces. Not many have been moved. The white rook's on b1, black rook on c7, black knight c6, white knight d6, with pawns on c4 and c5, and black's pawns are on e5 and d4. So instead of pushing on to d3, black plays his knight back to d8, discovering an attack on the c-pawn. White moved rook to b8. Black played knight e6. White moved rook to e8. Black played knight takes c5, and white played rook takes e5. Now white's won the e pawn, and the black d pawn is still quite vulnerable. White is threatening moves like rook to d5. Now black exchanged off the white knight. He played knight to b7. White knight takes b7. Black rook takes b7. White spotted the threat of mate and played king f1, bringing his king nearer to the center. Now this endgame is better for white, not just because he's got an extra pawn, but because his king can get more quickly into the action and possibly support the c-pawn to advance down the board. Now let's see how this factor of the rapidity of white's king centralization affects the game. Black played his rook down to b3. White defended the pawn by rook to a5. Black played pawn to d3. White plays king to e1, threatening to come up to d2. So black prevented this by rook to b2. And white took off rook takes a7. Well, it's two pawns now. Black plays rook to e2 check. White didn't play king f1. He went king to d1. He's allowing all his pawns to go on the king side in order that he can get his c-pawn through. Black played rook takes f2. Now if white plays his pawn down to c5 now, it's not much use because black will be able to play rook to c2. So white plays rook to d7 first in order to get rid of that pawn at d3. Black played rook takes g2, and white played triumphantly rook takes d3, and black played rook takes h2. White's two pawns each, but white's pawn is now ready to march down the board. And white now played pawn to c5, black played rook to h5. At this point black resigned, probably because the game was adjourned and he'd worked out that he was going to lose. But it's pretty clear that he won't be able to stop this pawn. Now let's see how. Perhaps you'd like to turn off and analyze how. Well, white's move should be rook c3. Black goes rook d5 check. King c2, rook to d8, so the black rook can stop the pawn immediately. Pawn to c6. Black king g8. Pawn to c7. Black rook to c8. Now white's king advances. King to b3. King f8. King to b4. King to e8. King to b5. King to d7. King to b6. White's just in time, and white will just drive away the king and move his king down to b7. If black instead tried to advance his pawns up the board, by pawn to g5 and pawn to h5, white would win in the same manner by advancing his king down to b7, and then he would later advance his a pawn down as well. Well, you'll have to take my word for that, because now we're going to go on to the next section and look at the move bishop to d2 on move, I think, 5, no, maybe 6. Now, return to diagram 3, and after black's pawn to h6, we'll bring the bishop back to d2. This doesn't involve a pawn sacrifice, and in fact it may involve the exchange of the bishop for black's knight. Therefore black will at least be relieved of worries about what to do with his knight, which he had in the last game. However, he still does have his worries. So, after bishop to d2, black plays bishop takes c3, white plays pawn takes c3. Now black goes knight to e4, white queen to g4, and now black has the same problem. Shall he play king f8 or shall he play pawn to g6? Well, if you play pawn to g6, you weaken your dark squares a bit, and white's going to be able to play h4, h5 to break up your position. Whereas if you play king to f8, your king gets stuck on the side where white's trying to attack. Now first we're going to look at a line where black plays the move king to f8. So play king f8, white moves bishop to d3, black knight takes on d2, white king takes on d2. Doesn't look right, of course, to bring the king into the center, but at least putting the king on the second rank allows the rooks to readily connect, and also the king guards the c3 pawn, which may be attacked later on by the black pieces. So king takes d2 has been played. Black advances pawn to c5. Black could actually have swapped off the queens by queen to g5 check, but this is probably not too good. White will capture and then play pawn to f4, and he'll regain his pawn if black plays pawn takes f4 by playing knight to h3, and then white will just have the better endgame because he's got the better bishop, and he'll be able to attack down the f-file. So queen to g5 doesn't really solve black's problems. He can't hope, as often in the French defense, black can't always hope for getting the better endgame. So he has to slog it out in the middle game. And the middle game isn't always that comfortable for him either. Just one of those cool things. So black's played pawn to c5. White now played knight to f3. White's not that afraid here of black playing pawn to c4 because his bishop will drop back to e2, and then white's king on d2 is much more secure than it otherwise would be. White can still continue with a kingside attack. So instead of playing pawn to c4, black plays queen to a5, and this pins the pawn on c3. So what black wants to do is to take on d4 and then start to attack down the c-file if he can against the c3 square. Trouble is, the queen on a5 is distanced a long way from the king side. So alternative suggestion of black is to play queen to c7 instead of queen to a5. And one of the ideas of this is that if white later plays queen to f4, then black will be able to answer by playing pawn to f5, because there's a concealed pin against the white e pawn, and white wouldn't be able to play pawn takes pawn on f6 without losing his queen. So queen c7 is a possible alternative. Anyway, black played queen to a5. White advanced pawn to h4. We saw in the previous game that white castled and played in the center. Here white's played his king up into the center, and his rooks are coming out along the side. It's a bit difficult to clear the pawns away, the f and the g pawns, so the rook has to develop in front of the pawns and get a rapid attack against black's g7 and f7 squares. So after pawn to h4, black developed with knight to c6, and one would have expected white to play rook to h3 here, but instead he played queen to f4. Now, not quite sure of the point of this move, though after black's next, a point was revealed. Now, black here might have played c takes d4. Let's look at that. White has to play knight takes d4. Black would play knight takes d4, and white would then play queen takes d4. Now black would develop bishop to d7. White brings his rook out to h3. And black plays rook to c8. White plays rook to g3. Now, let's see what white's threatening. Possibly queen to g4. So black could probably offer the exchange of queens here by queen to a4. Now this position isn't exactly desperate for black. It looks better for white because he has got the better bishop. But it looks like black could probably hold this position. So this might have been a better continuation for black than the one he played. Now let's return to diagram 6 and see what actually did happen after white played queen to f4. After queen to f4, black played the move pawn to b6, and this was a little too careless, a little too optimistic, because white now launched a strong attack. You might like to switch off the tape and decide what you'd play as white here. Well, white's move was the stunning knight to g5, and the reason this move can be played is because black's pawn to b6 shut off the retreat of his queen back to c7, which would have been needed to guard the f7 square. Now, if black just plays knight to d8, white can play knight takes f7 followed by bishop to g6. So black actually had to take the knight on g5. Black played pawn takes knight, white played pawn takes pawn. Now there's a discovery on the rook, and things are going to happen on f7 soon as well. So, well, he didn't play rook to g8. That doesn't look much good anyway. So he played rook takes h1. Well, white could recapture with the rook, but why bother? He played instead pawn to g6, threatening mate. Now if black plays pawn f5, white will just take en passant and threaten moves like queen to d6. So instead black started to run. He played his king to e7. White played rook takes h1. Black now played knight to d8. White played now rook to h7, just bringing his pieces into the attack on the king's side. Classic sort of attack here. Now let's see how this massacre continued. Black played here c takes on d4. White's g-pawn on g6 took on f7, threatening the queen. Black now checked with his pawn. Pawn takes on c3 check. White brought his king to a neutral square, king to d1. Now black had to recapture. He had to play knight takes f7. White played rook takes f7. Sorry, rook takes g7. And that, of course, is the winning move, because the queen's going to take on f7 check, ending the game. So that was an example of black playing king to f8. Perhaps he shouldn't have lost quite so drastically. Though the game does show that there can be disadvantages in having your king bottled up on the king side. So the next example we're going to look at is where black plays pawn to g6, and he has a bit more freedom of action with his king. And this is the game where black was the Russian Murray, as opposed to the Dutchman Hans Ray. But Murray is a very imaginative player, and he shows that the black game does lend itself to a creative approach. So despite some of the heavy defeats in this game, one shouldn't write off the variation. Right, back to diagram 3. This is after h6. White drops his bishop back to d2. Black now plays bishop takes c3, pawn takes c3, knight to e4. White plays queen to g4, and black plays pawn to g6. Now, in this game, white played bishop to d3. Normal sort of move, and now here black didn't capture the bishop on d2. Instead he played, or what do you think he played? Well, Murray's idea was to play bishop to d7. He's prepared to give up a pawn himself. If white plays bishop to takes e4, pawn takes e4, queen takes e4, black will play bishop to c6, and he'll have tremendous compensation along the white squares, and white will have parted with certainly his wrong bishop, and he'll be left with just a sort of preponderance of his own pieces on the dark squares. So naturally, white didn't accept this Greek gift, and instead white brought his own bishop back to c1. I think this deserves an exclamation mark. As in the earlier examples on this tape, white's sacrificing his c-pawn in order to sweep through the black king side. Now, do you think black should take the pawn on c3? Turn off your tapes and decide what white would do against it. Well, against knight takes c3, white doesn't have to rely on positional compensation. He can play immediately bishop takes g6, because if pawn takes g6, then white can play queen takes g6 check. This bishop takes g6 sacrifice often turns up in these sorts of lines of the MACCUTCHEON. Sometimes they work. In this case it works because when black moves his king to f8, white just plays bishop to a3 check, and that's that. So black can't play knight takes c3. Well, he can play it, and after bishop takes g6, play rook to g8. But this doesn't help him much either, because white will just play bishop takes f7 check, king takes f7, and then white has a fork, queen f3 check, which will pick up the knight on c3. So black must decline white's pawn sacrifice, and so black continues in this position. That's after white plays bishop to c1. Black continues with pawn to c5. Now we continue to develop sharply. After pawn c5 by black, white played knight to e2, and black played queen to a5. This move intends to answer white's bishop takes e4 by pawn takes e4, white queen takes e4, black bishop to c6, white queen to g4, and then black would take on d4, leaving white in a bit of a difficulty, because if he recaptures with the queen on d4, black would take the g2 pawn, and if he recaptures with the knight, then queen takes c3 check. So all the combinations are hanging together for black, for the time being at least. So black's played queen to a5. I'd like you to decide what you think white should play in this position. Turn off your tapes, have a look at the position. Well, white's move was a surprising pawn to f3. Black played knight takes c3, And now white just played bishop to d2. Once again, looks like black's in a lot of difficulties here because he looks as though he's going to lose his knight. Well, black, however, can hold on. He played c takes d4. And there's another tricky piece of tactics here. If white plays queen takes d4, black has a good answer. He can play knight takes e2, and after white takes the queen on e5, black will take the queen on d4. So white can't quite do that. So he has to play knight takes d4, and this gives black a respite. Black is still threatened by moves like knight e2 or knight to b3, but he should have time to save his knight now. Yeah, so black did defend his knight. He broke the pin. He played queen to c5. Now white probably should have played knight to b3 here, and after black queen c7, maybe bishop to f4, when white's a pawn down, but he has got a strong position. Instead, white played the move pawn to a4, which is an interesting move because he's still aiming to get something out of the trapping of the knight at c3. Well, after pawn to a4, black found a very strong move. I'd like you to see if you can find it as well. Well, black's move, in typical Murray fashion, was knight to e4, splitting white's position. His knight on d4 is now attacked, and also his bishop on d2. So now white seems to be in a bit of trouble. He's a pawn down, and the knight, of course, no chance of trapping it. After black's move knight e4, white now played bishop to e3, and black played queen to b4 check. White moved king to e2. I'd like you once again to turn off your tapes and decide how you'd play as black. Well, black's actual move was to play knight c3 check, which wasn't quite the best. If he'd have played pawn to h5, forcing the white queen back, because the white queen certainly can't go to f4 because g5 traps it. So h5, white would go queen h3, and now if black checked on c3 and then played knight to c6, black's definitely got the advantage. And you can see why black's got the advantage. It's all to do with the exposure of the white king, whereas the black king, no one's made any impression upon it at all yet. So black would have an extra pawn and a lot of play against the white king. Now let's see what was wrong with knight to c3 check. So black plays knight c3 check. Now white played his king to f2, bringing king into a bit of safety. Black plays knight to c6 here. White played queen to f4, guarding the e5 pawn. Black took on d4, knight takes d4, and now white played queen takes d4. Black queen took on d4, and white bishop took on d4. Well, things are looking a bit better for white now. He isn't in any trouble with his king, and at the moment he's only a pawn down. It looks like he's going to be another pawn down now, because black now played knight takes a4. Perhaps black thought this was good enough, but in fact it's not. So let's see, how would you continue as white in this position? White's move was rook from h1 to b1, attacking the pawn at b7, and black can't play knight to b6, of course, because of bishop takes b6, so black had to play pawn to b6. Now, how would you play as white in this position? White played a spectacular move here, rook to b5, cutting off the defense of the knight at c5, And of course, if black captures the rook, white will recapture and get 2 pieces against the rook. In fact, white's 2 bishops would be very strong in that position. Now black has to start returning pawns. Black played knight to c5, white played bishop takes c5, black played pawn takes c5, white rook takes c5. Now there's only one puny pawn on a7 to worry about, and we shouldn't have much difficulty there. Black now played king e7, white's rook from c5 went to a5, black rook went to b8 from h8, white played rook takes a7, black rook takes a7, white rook takes a7, black king to e8, and a meritorious draw was agreed by both sides. So a really fascinating game, that one, and it showed how the tactics can in some circumstances go in black's favour. But that sort of active play is something to model your game upon if you play this line as black. Now I'd like to say a few words about the theory of the MACCUTCHEON. After white's move pawn to e5, and black goes pawn to h6, white's got 3 main alternatives: to capture on f6 or drop his bishop back. Now we've seen that e takes f6 should be okay for black, and that leaves the moves bishop e3 and bishop to d2. Now bishop d2 has always been considered the best move, but in my opinion this is somewhat mistaken, and I think bishop e3 has got good chances as well. The idea of putting the bishop back onto e3 is different to bishop to d2 in the sense that you're retaining your black squared bishop. Even though this is in theory your worst piece, you don't actually want it to be exchanged. It has got good prospects against the weakened black squares on the king's side. So by retaining it, even at the cost of a pawn, white keeps his attacking chances. Whereas if you play bishop to d2, then you're already accepting the exchange of that bishop. Now we're going to be looking at a game Shamkovich-Pohorowicz, but let's carry on looking at a couple of other lines before we go through that game. Now after the move h6, we're going to look again at bishop to e3. Black plays knight e4, white plays queen to g4. Now here black has the choice of king f8 or pawn to g6. Now if black plays pawn to g6, I gave the line white pawn to a3, starting to sacrifice, black bishop takes, knight, pawn takes bishop, and now knight takes c3. Now instead of taking on c3, which as we've seen gives white chances to get his attack going, there's a possibility of black playing pawn to c5 immediately to get a counterattack in the position. Now let's look at that situation after pawn to c5. White now plays his bishop up to d3, and black goes queen to a5, threatening the fork. White defends with knight to e2. So black's already getting more counterplay than he did in the previous situation. Still, he has some difficulties even in this position, and a 1961 game went with black playing here pawn takes on d4, white played bishop takes d4, and black tried to extricate his knight by playing knight to c5. Well, white now castled, and black played knight to c6. Wonder what you'd play as white here. Well, white now played a speculative sacrifice. He played bishop takes on g6. Black played rook to g8. If he'd taken, then white's queen would have come into g6 with tremendous effect. Probably would have ended up forking the black rook. Anyway, black played rook to g8. White played bishop takes f7 check. Black played king takes f7. White played queen to h5 check. Well, white hasn't got any mating attack here, but what he has got is tremendous potential of playing f4 and f5 and just flattening black in that way. This is a very strong attack that white enjoys, and black's king is in a very bad situation here. In fact, this bishop takes g6 sacrifices have always got to be looked out for, and we've seen it in an earlier instance. Now I'd like now to look at the game Shamkovich-Prohorovitz, and this starts from diagram 3 with white going bishop to e3, black knight e4, white queen to g4. Black king now moved to f8. White played pawn to a3. Black bishop takes c3 check. White pawn takes on c3. And black captured the pawn, knight takes c3. White moved bishop to d3. And black played pawn to b6. He's hoping to exchange off one of white's dangerous bishops. Very logical idea. White came up with pawn to h4. Black bishop moved to a6, and white just ignored it. He played rook to h3. You can see what his threat is, rook to g3. Now, if black plays bishop takes on d3, we get a very instructive series of moves which are worth playing through. So bishop takes d3, c takes d3. Black now develops knight to d7, white rook to g3, black pawn to g6. Now if black had played rook to g8, white would have played bishop takes h6. And I think if black had played rook h7, then also bishop takes h6 looks okay. So g6 looks the only move. Now white plays bishop d2. Black knight goes to a4. Not having much influence on the course of the game there. And white now plays pawn to h5, starting to open up the g file. Black plays g5, and white uses his other pawn to f4. And now white's attack looks very strong, because there isn't much black can do to stop the king side getting opened up. So this sort of prizing maneuver needs to be studied very carefully. It's the sort of standard way white would break into black's position. Now let's return some of those pieces. If you put white's rook on h3, white's queen is still on g4. White's pawns are on h4 and f2, and he's got bishops on e3 and d3. As for black, he has a pawn on g7 and another one on h6. He has knights on c3 and b8, and his bishop is still on a6. King's on f8, of course. Rook's on h8. Right, now, after rook h3, black didn't play bishop takes d3. He decided to cut down white's space on the king's side. He played pawn to h5. White moved his queen to f4. Black now played queen to e7. Now white transferred his attack. He played rook to f3. And black, surprisingly enough, didn't play bishop takes d3. He played instead king to g8. White played knight to h3. Well, it looks like there's a lot of pressure on the f7 square. White probably doesn't even need his d3 bishop. So knight came to h3, very good move. Black finally did capture. Bishop takes d3. White pawn takes d3. Black now. Well, black now played his knight to a6. And these knights on the queen side are really totally pitiful pieces. Well, as you're white, and on the winning side, try and find a decent move for him in this position. White's actual choice of move was queen to g3. Looks like a retreat, but in fact he's going to bring his bishop to g5 and to f6. And this really hammers home our point that what white should be doing is to start to play on the black squares. And this move really puts black into tremendous difficulty. Black played pawn to c5. White brought his bishop to g5. Well, in this position, black didn't fancy going to f8 because then white would play knight to f4, threatening knight takes e6 or knight to g6. So after bishop to g5, black played queen to e8. White now went bishop to f6, and black played queen to f8 at this point. Of course, if black had played rook to h7, then knight to g5 looks pretty good. Anyway, queen to f8 happened. White plays queen to g5. Black played his knight to b5. This was actually a reasonable move. White went rook to g3. Black went rook to h7. White's knight came to f4. So now there's going to be 4 pieces trained on that g7 square. Black played knight takes d4. Maybe he's going to get a fork in on c2. Anyway, what would you play as white now? It's your move. Well, have you decided? White played the move bishop to e7. This was going to clear the way to bring a knight round to f6. And in fact, white won this game quite easily after bishop to e7. Let's see how it went. Now, after bishop e7, black plays pawn to f6. Doesn't move his queen because of knight takes h5. White played pawn takes f6. Black played queen to f7. Well, if you want to see the rest of the game, it's in the booklet. Meanwhile, we're going to see if we can improve black's play a little, even in the bishop e3 line, possibly by seeing if we can transpose into the Coinzi-Mouret game we saw earlier against the bishop d2 line. Now back to diagram 3, after h6, bishop e3, knight e4, white queen to g4, black pawn to g6, and now white pawn to a3. Now, after this, black can play bishop takes c3 check, pawn takes c3, and now possibly pawn c5. White goes bishop d3. Once again, instead of retreating, black will play bishop d7 here. Now, white can continue with knight e2 with the idea of trapping the knight by playing pawn to f3 in a minute. Black's move pawn to c4 comes into consideration here, but we'll continue with the queen to a5 move. We've got almost exactly the same position, except white's bishop is on e3 instead of c1, and he's got a pawn on a3 instead of a2. Now, if white plays pawn to f3 here, black can play knight takes c3, and if bishop to d2, then pawn takes d4 again, as in the Coinzi-Mouret game. So it looks like if black is prepared to sacrifice a pawn by leaving his knight on e4 and letting white take it with the bishop, then he could get good chances by the opening up of the diagonal, and his bad bishop becomes suddenly good. An alternative plan for black, after queen to g4, pawn to g6, is to try and bolt with his king to the queen side. If white plays pawn a3, black bishop takes c3 check, white pawn takes bishop, black queen to e7, white bishop d3. Now here black can play knight takes c3, which is okay if white continues with h4 and so on, because black just plays knight c6, bishop d7 and castles queenside. However, if white plays instead bishop to d2, there's more trouble for black, because when he goes knight to a4, white can play bishop to b4, which is uncomfortable for the black queen. After, say, c5, d takes c5, a5, black drives away the bishop, but at the same time he opens up the queen side, which isn't quite what he wants. He wants to keep a closed position. Well, if all these suggestions don't work, and in fact black's movement of his knight into the center of the board into e4 gets it into more trouble than it's worth, then it's maybe worth considering, after white's bishop e3, or even after his bishop d2, that black can retreat his knight to d7 instead of coming into e4. Then if queen to g4, black isn't necessarily having to play g6 or king f8, he can drop his bishop back to f8. Now, because of the position of white's knight on c3, black's coming pawn to c5 will have some undermining effect upon the white center, and the white d4 pawn can't be bolstered up by the pawn at c3, so the whole position of white's pawns in the center at e4, e5 and d4 may become weakened. Of course, white can play moves like knight from c3 to e2 and then pawn to c3, but this does take him a bit of time and also hampers his development a little. So that's one thought to be going on with. Can black play, instead of knight to e4, can he play his knight from f6 to d7?